On Thursday, the U.S. Supreme Court has decided to gut the ability of the federal government, these federal agencies, specifically the EPA, to fight against climate change. So now in the, of course, 6-3 decision, the extremely conservative Supreme Court has decided to strip the EPA of the ability to regulate carbon emissions from power plants. Now, this was part of the Clean Air Act that allows the EPA to regulate power plants. But of course, the Supreme Court made the argument that, Congress, yes, they can, delegate these responsibilities to different agencies, but, they just weren't specific enough. They just weren't specific enough in delegating the responsibility or the ability to regulate carbon emissions from the Environmental Protection Agency. Because carbon emissions, reducing them, apparently does nothing to protect the environment, according to conservatives. So, yeah, can you tell I'm a little mad? So, look, obviously, the conservatives, the modern Republican Party is against any climate regulation. They didn't like the Obama administration's interpretation of the rule under the Clean Air Act that allowed them to regulate these power plants, because Congress will do and has done basically nothing, because most of Congress is bought by fossil fuel corporations. And so this case was originally brought to the Supreme Court by West Virginia. It's funny because, West Virginia, home of Joe Manchin, big coal mining state. Joe Manchin, of course, has done everything he can because he has coal, investments. He literally owns a coal company, gets a lot of his money from coal and that industry, as well as a lot of political donations from it. And so he has been blocking all of Biden's basically policies when it comes to trying to do anything about climate change. And of course, West Virginia comes in. This is West Virginia Attorney General Patrick Morrisey, who originally sued the federal government over this rule and was joined by Republican attorneys general from more than a dozen states, red states, along with lawyers representing, you guessed it, coal companies. That's right. The plaintiffs say that regulatory power should be taken away from the agency and given to Congress. So now they say that, of course, because everyone knows that Congress isn't going to do a goddamn thing to curb climate. They're just not. It's the world's most open secret. Yes, they know Congress is corrupt, especially the Senate. They know that there are people on the Senate that will never allow any sort of regulation on coal companies in order to reduce emissions of these, of that industry, of these power plants. And so they go with a nice little sleight of hand. They say, oh, yeah, well, no, we're just going to send it back to Congress. That's what we're going to do. That's right. We're going to send it back to Congress and then let them do something, because the EPA, obviously, too much. We don't want to give them too much regulatory power. So, again, the EPA, thanks to this Supreme Court, no longer has the power to make any rules limiting emissions from power plants. And when on that front, when it comes to the environment, we're basically screwed. We are well and pretty well fucked, okay? But you know what? That's not all. It gets worse, believe it or not. I know. Every time I say that, I know you all collectively cringe and go, oh God, he just said it's going to get worse. Oh, well, it's true. It is going to get worse. So why don't we dive into what this means in the broader context?
Oh, no.
All right. In addition to the court ruling that the EPA, this agency, cannot regulate these emissions, the court also cut back on regulatory agency authority in general, invoking the so-called major questions doctrine, a rule a ruling that will impact the federal government's authority to regulate in other areas of climate policy, as well as regulation of the internet and worker safety. So, look, worker safety, obviously that means OSHA. Okay? The internet, FCC. So now those agencies, now some of those decisions are going to be handed back to Congress, who will then do absolutely nothing. OSHA will have absolutely, even less power to protect workers from exploitation, unsafe working conditions, etc. Their regulatory power will be dismantled. And we know that because, again, sending this back to Congress means you're sending it back to a bunch of people whose literal careers and paychecks depend on them serving corporate masters. Gee, I wonder who they're going to side with, everybody. Gee. Steve Vladeck, CNN's Supreme Court analyst and professor at the University of Texas School of Law, had some words about this ruling and said that it could be cataclysmic for modern administrative law. For a century, the federal government has functioned on the assumption that Congress can broadly delegate regulatory power to executive branch agencies, he says. Today's ruling opens the door to endless challenges out to those delegations on everything from climate change to food safety standards, on the ground that Congress just wasn't specific enough in giving the agency the power to regulate such major issues. Regarding the EPA, Roberts wrote that capping carbon dioxide emissions at a level that will force a nationwide transition away from the use of coal may be a quote-unquote sensible solution. But it is not plausible that Congress gave EPA the authority to adopt its own such a regulatory scheme under the law in question. A decision of such magnitude and consequence rests with Congress itself, or an agency acting in pursuant to a clear delegation from that representative body. And again, how likely are we to get Congress to do that? There's about a 0% chance. Fat freaking chance of that happening. Congress will sit there and do nothing while they collect checks. And that is exactly what they had hoped would happen, of course. Writing separately, Justice Neil Gorsuch also emphasized the court's move to limit agency power, which he considers to be unaccountable to the public, which is ironic because here you have a Supreme Court that is unelected and completely unaccountable to the public. Huh. Irony. Very, very ironic. Okay. Now he says this. While we all agree that administrative agencies have important roles to play in a modern nation, surely none of us wishes to abandon our republic's promise that the people and their representatives should have a meaningful say in the laws that govern them. Very, very interesting that he says that, right? Because we know as a fact that Congress doesn't represent the will of the average person in this country, specifically the Senate. I mean, again, I'm pretty sure you're all familiar now with the study that shows that somewhere upwards of 90% of issues that the public wants done don't happen because they don't align with the interests of the wealthy and the corporations, and so therefore in our government don't get done. We live in an oligarchy which is fastly approaching theocracy. So we're going to be a theocratic oligarchy pretty soon. And they're really, really pushing us towards it. Now, speaking of the people, right? So let's get some polling, okay? So I've got a couple of graphics here from polls that were taken from Data for Progress on how people feel about regulatory power of the EPA. Feels appropriate, right, to bring that up. All right, so turns out a majority of voters believe the EPA should be allowed to regulate air pollution. Huh, weird. And that is specifically air pollution that contributes to climate change, you know, like carbon dioxide. When you break it down, 60% of likely voters say that yes, the EPA should be allowed to regulate air pollution. Just 24% say no. 15%, I'd love to find the 15% who have no freaking clue what's going on. Really, really. Like, you got no idea. Like, you're not paying attention. Look, I understand that most people are not, like, you know, tuned into the news, right? But you should probably have an idea. At least with, like, oh, should there be you know, an agency to regulate air pollution? Yes, that should be 100% yes. 15%, I don't know, air pollution, I hear it might be good. No. Now, of course, when you break it down, 80% of Democrats, not surprising. 10% of Democrats say, oh, no, you shouldn't regulate air pollution. Get the fuck out of here. Get the fuck out of the party. Who are you? Are you? Literally Joe Manchin. That's who it is. Independents, 60%. Still say, yeah, let's have the EPA. Republicans are evenly split down the middle. 42% said, yeah, of course the EPA. Ironically, the EPA was created under a Republican administration. And then 42% said, no, not at all. No, I don't think the EPA should do anything. The EPA? No, get rid of the EPA. They also want to get rid of the Department of Education, Department of Energy, Department of everything. They just want to get rid of everything. Everything. You know, unless, of course, it's to enforce their bans on abortion. Of course, they don't want to get rid of that. Or enforce their bans on, you know, sodomy, because, of course, they want to get rid of that as well. There's more, right? I've got another poll for you. Great. All right. Again, a majority of voters also believe the EPA should be allowed to regulate emissions from power plants, 62% of likely voters. So that's a slightly different question, but again, directly related to what we're talking about here, because that is a rule that is in the the Clean Air Act. Yes, they have the power. Again, this time Republicans are not a split. They say, oh, regulating power plants? No. 47% say absolutely no. No, we're not going to do that. And then finally, we have another one here. And this is on the Supreme Court. Here you have 63% of voters, likely voters, that were concerned about the Supreme Court doing exactly what it did today. Remove environmental protections established by the Clean Air Act. There you go. And so, yeah. And there's more polling, of course. There's a Washington Post, ABC News poll from last year that, again, where 70% of U.S. adults answered yes to the question of, do you think the federal government should or should not regulate the release of greenhouse gases from power plants, cars, and factories in an effort to reduce global warming? Again, vast majority of the American people, the only people who disagree, once again, Republicans, 46 to 47. So understand why I bring up the polling. Because what you have here is a minority of people that are holding the rest of the country back. You have a small extremist minority in the Republican Party, the minority of the minority, somewhere around 30 million people out of a country of 330 million people, that say, I just want to see everything burn. And we're going to let it burn. The tyranny of the minority. That's what we're living in right now. And unfortunately, that Supreme Court represents that minority. And by the way, when it comes to the left and criticism of the Biden administration, remember the Biden administration also hasn't done a lot when it comes to climate change, to curbing it. For example, 80% of Americans who label themselves left-leaning say the Biden administration has been doing too little to address climate change, and that includes 64% of Democrats. But now, the Biden administration is unable to do anything. They can't even regulate emissions anymore. So now the dissent here, let me read it from Elena Kagan, writing for the dissenters, said that the court's decision strips the EPA of the power Congress gave it to respond to the most pressing environmental challenge of our time. Quote, the court appoints itself instead of Congress or the expert agency, the decision maker on climate policy. That is absolutely true. But they don't care about experts. They don't care about facts or knowledge. This is not about reality. This is not about policy or anything like that. No, it's about ideology. That's what it is. Their ideology, well, I'll get into that in a minute. But first, she says more. She says, she ends it up by saying, I cannot think of many things more frightening. Going back to Vladeck, he said the lack of congressional willpower will lead to the erosion of federal power. Quote, it would be one thing if Congress could be expected to respond to this ruling by updating all of those delegations to make them more specific. But we and the court know that it won't, which will almost surely lead to significant deregulation across a wide swath of federal authority. And there it is. That's what we have. Lobbyists and fossil fuel companies, they're paid lackeys in Congress. They wanted this ruling because that's exactly what they want to do. They want this to lead to even more deregulation so that they can make money. Look, Neil Gorsuch, he's a corporatist. We know this. Most of the Supreme Court right now is pro-corporate. And I believe it was Gorsuch that ruled once that a man should be fired for not choosing to freeze to death in his truck by abandoning his load to get to safety. He says, no. You should have died. You should have froze to death for your corporation, for your corporate masters, because that's who I serve, not you. But others, they're actually even more dangerous, and they still align on this issue. Not just because they're corporatists, but because they're religious extremists. See, Amy Coney Barrett, definitely a religious extremist. Thomas believes in all these different conspiracy theories, also probably religious extremist. And understand why I bring this up. These rulings kind of go to the point of accelerationism, if you will, right? Because, look, the beliefs here that some of these evangelical Christians, these very right-wing evangelical Christians, is the end times. That's their big belief. The end times where obviously the world is destroyed and Jesus comes back and vacuums everyone up into heaven. That's what they believe in. And so, look, I understand that I think almost every generation believes there's a certain sect of people that believe that the end times is upon us, right? But it never happens. So here's the Supreme Court. Here's the right-wingers, the extremists on the Supreme Court, saying, oh, it's not happening. That's okay. Let's just make it happen. Let's do accelerationism. Let's put our foot on the gas, if you will, and, just let the world burn. Because then we can have Jesus come back. I got news for you. there is no Jesus that's coming back. The rapture, by the way, the rapture is also made up. And you can go and you can talk to a lot of theological people who are, Christians, and say, yeah, that's actually not a real thing. That's not going to happen. It's one of those weird fanatical beliefs by a certain sect of Christianity. What is going to happen is a lot of very bad things. Again, catastrophic climate change, right? I mean, that's going to create more massive droughts. I mean, they're already, suffering a huge drought in the West. Then you have famines, wars, economic strife, mass migration, and the conflict that brings. And so all that stuff, boy, that's going to look a lot like the end times by creating more political and economic instability in this world. So I guess, to some people, that's definitely going to look like the end times. I just wish we had a Supreme Court that wasn't also trying to make the end times happen by playing accelerationism. But here we are. We're in that situation.